speech is not free. And that's why this Supreme Court case is so important. Okay, so make sure you know this, that in Schenck versus the United States, it set the precedent that speech can be restricted if it presents a clear and present danger. All right, so we know that during World War One, before World War One, after World War One, immigration continues to happen. But in the aftermath of World War One, there's going to be efforts to restrict immigration more specifically. Um, and so uh, what we see is that before World War One, it's going to be this real peak of European immigration, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe. Well, that leads to nativism, which is really just a distrust of immigrants and this feeling that immigrants are going to somehow, upset the purity of America and cause sort of like cause some issues in America and stuff like that. There's distrust because some immigrants are not Christian, or rather they're Protestants and not, or rather they're Catholics, I should say, and not Protestants, and a variety of things. And what that leads to is it leads to the United States passing a series of quota laws, which we'll talk about in later on. But the aftermath of World War One and this immigration leads to some very specific events taking place. And one of them is known as the Red Scare, which happens right after World War One is over in 1919. The Red Scare is the result of growing anti-communist sentiment after the war. This comes after the Russian Revolution, in which the communist Bolsheviks, again, just something dealing with world history. You can look it up. Russian Revolution, very interesting thing, but we don't have time to talk about it here. There was a fear of Russian immigrants coming into America and people from Southern and Eastern Europe coming into America because they were afraid that they would be communists and come and overthrow America, just like Russians, communists had done in Russia. What this leads to is something known as xenophobia, which is a fear and distrust of immigrants, which usually leads to violence against immigrants. Okay, and so that really leads to more restrictions on immigrants and these new quotas on who and how many immigrants can come into America. And so what we see here in this political cartoon from this time period is that European anarchists, is someone who doesn't want authority telling them what to do, is somehow going to come and bomb and destroy American liberty, represented here by the Statue of Liberty. And so the Red Scare leads to something known as the Palmer Raid. So in your notes, if you want to write like an arrow or something like that, Red Scare, Palmer leads to Palmer Raids. That way you kind of know that they're connected. It's a cause and effect moment. The Palmer Raids are going to occur at the height of this Red Scare, right? Now there will be another Red Scare after World War II, coincidence or repeating history, but this is kind of the first Red Scare. And so the Palmer Raids are basically this. Attorney General Mitchell Palmer is going to task this man named J. Edgar Hoover. Remember that name because it's going to keep coming up over and over and over again, especially in the Cold War after World War II. J. Edgar Hoover is going to be tasked with secretly gathering information on suspected radicals, which are people like the European anarchists pictured over here, who favor drastic political change and or social change. And meaning that a radical would be someone who's willing to do whatever it took to force the change. So in this picture here, this European anarchist would be an example of a radical. Gavrilo Princip, who assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand to kind of spark World War I, is considered a radical, someone who's willing to do a drastic thing to get change. Okay. Oops. So what we see here with this is it's going to lead to mass arrests of anarchists, socialists, and labor union leaders, and many, many others, immigrants as well. Around 6,000 to 500 people wind up getting deported. And here we have a political cartoon kind of depicting these Palmer raids taking place. All right, so following these, quotas and Red Scare and the Palmer raids, we have this increase in migration, which is movement within the United States. And something we need to know about, which we're going to talk a little bit about more in the coming weeks, is this Great Migration. The Great Migration is basically just a large portion of Southern Black population moving into urban industrial areas in the North. So they're trying to escape, basically, the oppressive life living in the Jim Crow South. And they're going to look for jobs mostly in New York City and in Chicago and in areas experiencing industrial booms like Indiana and Ohio, Pennsylvania, etc. And the real kind of benefit of this for many African American people moving is that because of these immigrant quotas, as I talked about earlier, there's not going to be enough immigrants to fill a lot of these industrial jobs. Remember, in the Gilded Age, the Progressive era, immigrants filled a lot of these factory jobs. Well, with these quotas, now there's not a lot of workforce. So, but then filling those spaces, these open jobs in these factories, is these migrating groups of Black people leaving the South, fleeing this oppressive Jim Crow South. Now, another benefit of them leaving is that there's not as much systemic racial discrimination. However, there is racial discrimination and racial violence, which we'll talk about next week when we talk about the 1920s specifically. But the Great Migration is a thing that it's kind of a migratory phenomena of African American people leaving the South beginning in this 1919, 1918 period and extending all the way into the 1960s and 70s as well. And so the Great Migration, make sure you know that. We'll talk a little bit about more. We'll talk more about it in the coming weeks as well. And so here's a map just kind of showing around 1900, the population of African American people is predominantly here in the South still, even 50 plus years after after the Civil War is even over. The majority of the Black population in the United States is still living in the South. But check this out: upwards of 90 or more percent of the Black population had been living in the American South since 1790. But notice here, around 1910, the population begins to decrease, and then it just decreases by leaps and bounds every single year, leading up into dropping as low as 53% for a number of years. This is the Great Migration, beginning around this 1910, 1915 period, and just continuing more and more until the present day, when of the African American population living in the United States, around 60% live in the South. Still a lot, but not nearly as much as there used to be. So let's review for a moment. How did the United States encourage patriotism in order to pay for the war effort? Well, keep in mind, pay Liberty bonds. Okay. What is a total war? Well, total war is where the whole country uses all of its resources in order to win. That's a total war. What is the significance of increased immigration after the war? Well, one, it's nativism. Then it's the Red Scare. Then xenophobia. Then it's the Palmer Raids. Okay, so that's kind of the significance, those issues. And make sure you know what these terms are, what nativism is, what is the Red Scare, like why did it happen? What is xenophobia? And what's the context of this xenophobia? And then what are the Palmer Raids? And then what is the effect of these Palmer Raids? So how did the World War I impact Black folks in the South? Well, they moved to the North in the Great Migration. And finally, what is the significance of Schenck versus the United States? Make sure you understand this. It establishes the precedent that speech is not free if it presents a clear and present danger to the country. And that's it, guys. That's the end of the videos about World War I. Next week, we'll talk about the Roaring Twenties.